Welcome to today's edition of the Author's Corner, brought to you by KNEO 91.7 FM The Word. I'm Roberta Foster, and today I welcome Terrie Todd back to Author's Corner. She has now written a book called Even If We Cry, which is published by Mountain Brook Inc., and she'll tell you more about how to find the book at the end of the program. Here's a little bit about Terrie. She is a Canadian author of 7 historical and split-time novels and 1 nonfiction book. Her work has earned numerous Word Awards from the Word Guild, the 2018 Jeanette Oak Award from Inscribed Christian Writers Fellowship, and the 2022 Braun Book Award. She's also a Carol Award finalist. And as mentioned, she lives in Canada, specifically in Portage-la Prairie, Manitoba. So, Terrie, thank you so much for being with us again.
Thanks so much for having me, Roberta. It's nice to be back.
Well, this book has as its background a subject that I've never heard of before. And I'm not much of a historian, so that's not too surprising. But why don't you tell us about the history that this book was based upon?
Well, I hadn't heard about it either. I had heard about what they used to call the home children, and which is a little bit different, but there's a lot of books that have been written about the home children. These were British children going back to the 1800s, orphans or children of families so destitute that their parents couldn't afford to feed them. And so the British saw that moving these kids to Canada was a triple benefit. It was a way to free their streets and orphanages of what they considered urchins, and it was a way to populate their colonies with white children and provide a labor force for farms and industries in Canada. And, it was really quite the thing. So a lot of books have been written about that. I always found it quite fascinating and tragic. And so one day I was in a thrift store and I came across a book called The Guest Children, and I just assumed it was the same thing. I grabbed the book, and then I realized, it has a subtitle. It's the story of the British child evacuees sent to Canada during World War II. So this is a little bit different. This was a whole scheme that the British and Canadian governments came up with to evacuate children out of Britain during World War II to keep them safe from the bombs. And I think we've heard about them being evacuated into the countryside. The Chronicles of Narnia came out of that.
Okay.
But when they finally decided, no, we've got to get them clean away, they came up with this scheme called CORB for short. It was the Children's Overseas Reception Board. They sent children to Canada, to Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, but primarily to Canada. And so when I started reading this book, this first book that I got, and it was the stories of people who are now adults telling their stories, I just found it so fascinating, and I thought there's just so much potential there for human drama to be told, and I knew I wanted to write a book about it.
And as I started reading the book, one of the things that stood out was that the parents actually had contact with the parents in Canada that were going to be taking in their children. And so that kind of made it a connection versus just putting all your children on a boat or airplane and sending them off not knowing what was going to happen next. And so,
right. Go ahead.
But then I find at the very beginning the plot twists right off the bat, and after the children are already on their way, parents receive a letter that says, we're not going to be able to take all your kids at one time.
Right, yeah.
So did that happen quite a bit?
Well, in some cases there was that connection ahead of time. If you were in Britain and you made this decision for your children, as difficult as it would be to make that decision, you might have a connection in Canada. You might already know someone or have family over there who was willing to take in your children, and that was great. But for a lot of them, it wasn't like that. It was just total strangers. So for my main characters, it was a little bit in between. They didn't know each other, but there was a distant connection where they had worked together. And the kids and the parents are adamant that their 3 children stay together in the same home. but somehow communication broke down, and the family that was expected to receive them could only take one child, and you find out later why those reasons were in place. But there's just so much potential there when you think of first of all, the parents having to make that choice, which you can't even imagine. And for that reason, this is my ninth novel now. I've dedicated all my books to somebody, but I've never dedicated any of them to my own children, partly because I have 3, and I thought, I never know when this is going to be my last book, right? So if I dedicate it to one of them. Anyway, so this one I chose to dedicate to my 3 children because I thought, if I wasn't a mother, I couldn't begin to comprehend the unthinkable choices that these characters faced. And so they had to make that decision, everything that they went through. And then you're looking at the kids, and some of them were just little. And depending on the temperament of the children, they might look at it as a big adventure, or they might look at it as the ultimate rejection. Mommy and Daddy are sending me away and not understand. There's just so many different angles to explore. And as I wrote the story, I tried to work in, because they're still children, they're going through all the normal things that kids go through, and they end up in this loving home, thankfully, but they're still kids, and Jeffrey is a 10-year-old, mischievous boy, and he's always getting into some kind of trouble, and little Hazel, she's 7, and they've got this older foster sister who resents their presence. Hazel gets into her makeup one day and gets it all over her face and wrecks it. And I really enjoyed writing that scene because it's quite comical, but it's the kind of thing that, just happened in normal life. And I wanted to bring those kinds of stories in so that it's not all just war drama, and so on. But there was just a lot of things to explore with it.
Okay. Well, there's more to talk about with Terrie Todd regarding her book, Even If We Cry. It's published by Mountain Brook Inc. You are listening to Author's Corner, and I'm Roberta Foster. Terrie, tell us about the faith elements that you wrote into your novel, Even If We Cry.
Well, Nina and her siblings, coming from England, they're part of a community where they probably attended an Anglican church, not necessarily every Sunday, but, for sure at Christmas and New Year's, and it was seen as more of a formal affair.
Okay.
Wasn't particularly relevant to their lives. And they come into a Canadian family's home where they attend a small country church, and there's none of the things that they're used to, the stained glass windows and the robes and the big pipe organ and all that, and then people are just themselves. But she's seeing a vibrant faith there that affects every aspect of their lives, and they take it home, and they pray at meals, and they talk, and they read Scripture. And so little by little, she's beginning to see how their faith affects their lives and how it includes joy, which she hadn't seen before. And gradually she learns to lean into this new version of Christianity as the trials and tribulations come. And one of her biggest lessons is that she doesn't need to carry the weight of responsibility solely on her shoulders. She comes over, her parents have put her in charge of her younger siblings for the duration of the trip, and somehow she still feels responsible for everything for them. And so she learns how to ask for help and accept help from other people, and sometimes it comes from the least expected sources.
Always a plot twist. Well, and then another one of the unique storylines appears to be that a fourth sibling comes into the story. How did that go about, too?
Well, the children left England with no clue that their mother was actually pregnant. And so later, a few months later, and they get a letter that there's this new little brother. And Nina, who's 14 by this time, 15 maybe, she's just miffed because she thinks, how dare they have another child, not really understanding quite how it all works. And the other two are overjoyed because they think this is the greatest thing. It brings a whole other level of complication to the story. And, they don't know if they're ever even going to get to meet him or not as the war goes on.
Well, what's one of the things that you hope people take away after they've read your book?
If you scroll through the reviews on Amazon, one common theme that readers are saying is that they, just like you said, I was not aware of this element of history. And so it's exciting to be able to give people that and say, here's what happened. But I think more importantly, one reader said, the ultimate self-sacrifice, love, and forgiveness is what shines through. And that's what stayed with her. And so I'm hoping that people will get that and just a sense of God's providence over it all. I mean, there were such horrible, horrible things happening to almost everybody during that time. We're facing dark days again now, and, people are horrified and people are scared. And God has been faithful, and He will be again.
Yes,
and if I can encourage people in that regard, then I'm happy.
Great. Well, this book is part of a series, so tell us about what happens next in your writing.
Yes, it's part of a series of 2 books called the Even If series, so this is Even If We Cry. The next one is called Even If I Perish, and that'll come out in November. And it came out of, while I was researching this book, I discovered that one of the ships that came across carrying children was sunk by a Nazi U-boat. Actually, there were a couple of them that were sunk. On the first one, the children all survived. They were picked up, and I think that one boosted everybody's confidence that, okay, we can do this, even if the boat sinks, the kids will be okay. But when the city of Benares left with 90 children on board, it was sunk. 77 of those kids died. Oh. And I just kind of came across this story, and I thought, oh, my goodness, there's a whole other story that needs to be written. I had never heard anything about it. Of the survivors, there was 6 boys who survived for 8 days in a little lifeboat on the North Atlantic, and the woman that looked after them, her name was Mary Cornish. And so I wrote that story and that's the closest I've ever come to writing a real story, fictionalizing a true story like that. I use the actual historical figures as my main characters.
Okay.
And I use the same structure in both books. So they're structured a little differently. I've always loved, epistolary books where there's lots and lots of letters. And so in both of these books, the main narrative of each chapter is from the point of view of the main character, but every chapter begins and ends with a letter between other characters.
Okay.
And so then that fills the reader in on some different points of view.
Okay. All righty. Well, today I have been talking with Terrie Todd about her book, Even If We Cry. So, Terrie, tell our listeners how they can find out more about this book and maybe even your past book.
Right. Well, the easiest way is just to go on Amazon. My author page is there. If you type in Even If We Cry, then that book in particular will come up. It's available in paperback or ebook on Kindle. If you're a Kindle user, like Kindle Unlimited, then you can read it for free. And if you're not an Amazon user, just ask at your bookstore. They can order it for you. And it's available through the publisher, Mountain Brook Inc. as well.
So one more time, the book is Even If We Cry, and I've been talking with Terrie Todd. We certainly thank her for sending a copy of the book to us today. And Terrie, thank you so much for enlightening our listeners into the content of Even If We Cry.
Thank you so much for having me.
And to our listeners, if you'd like to hear this interview again or share it with another, you can find it on your favorite podcast platform or through kneo.org. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Roberta Foster on the Author's Corner. Join me again next time.
Are you walking in everything God has for you? Hi, I'm Pastor Gary Culp, and I'd like to invite you to check out the Exceedingly Abundant Ministries podcast, available from the Sky High Podcast Network. This 30-minute weekly Bible study will give you time to grow spiritually and get to know God and His Word on a deeper level. God has more in store for you than you ever realized. Listen to Exceedingly Abundant Ministries today and learn about how God can do more with your life than you ever imagined.